This episode was supported by Eurochild.
What are children's realities in Europe? Read Eurochild's Progress and Gaps report, examining the state of poverty, social exclusion and governmental efforts in 31 countries, and see what can be done to respect, protect and fulfil children's rights.
Today in the EU, what we expect from the last day of COP29. The Global Climate Summit is wrapping up today in Baku, and country ministers have already started tough negotiations around the final treaty. All eyes are on the sum that will be allocated to the new climate finance goal, which will determine how much developed countries will provide to the Global South to limit greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a big discrepancy in ambition and timeline between the two parties, which has so far locked talks in a standstill. Where are the COP29 climate talks headed, and where does the EU stand in these negotiations? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Today, I'm here in the studio with Niko Kurmayer, energy and climate reporter at Euractiv. Hi, Niko.
Hello.
So this COP29 is coming to an end. Looking back now, what were some highlights and lowlights of the past 2 weeks?
One lowlight was the Loss and Damage Fund, which was created last year due to some last-minute diplomacy between the UAE and Germany, which is supposed to be a credible commitment by us to the Global South, and to sort of get them away from the influence of China, which we believe is not always in their own interest to be seen in a block with. Mm-hmm. This crucial fund, to date, has only been equipped with approximately $800 million. So we're talking millions, not billions. And this year saw, I think, approximately only $90 million pledged to the fund.
Wow.
Compared to the 700-ish that were pledged last year. And I think that politically abandoning the tool of the Loss and Damage Fund is potentially going to hurt us in the long term.
How so?
Because it is the wedge that we believe we've managed to drive between the G77 and China. And if we don't keep hammering onto it, then it represents a lost opportunity of sorts from a negotiations perspective. Another lowlight that I want to highlight is the fact that if you compare last year's COP to the UAE's debutante ball to the global diplomacy sphere, This is a house party in the basement of some 16-year-olds. I don't think that the Azerbaijani presidency tried very hard to be seen in a positive light, particularly not by us.
Why do you say that?
Because while we were negotiating, they were busy attacking France in the papers and accusing everybody else of either its colonial history or their neo-colonialist tendencies. And at the same time, of course, the classic suppression of dissidents and the alignment with Russia in many issues. This was a COP where Russia felt comfortable attending with a high-level representative.
And what are some of the good news that came out in this 2 weeks?
I'm not done with the bad news yet.
Oh, you're not done with the bad news. Okay, my apologies.
Energy, no progress whatsoever, or very little. The best pledge that came out of COP29 this year around was one that was already previously created at the G7 level, which is to sextuple energy storage and build some 23,000 kilometers of extra cable. But it's not something that the presidency came up with, nor is it something where the EU and the presidency cooperated to create a really strong pledge. Just to compare, last year we had the tripling up, doubling down pledge, which is tripling renewables capacity and doubling energy efficiency improvements, which if achieved, which it won't be, because nobody cares about energy efficiency ever, because it's politically controversial in some way, shape, or form, that would be massive, in the sense that energy efficiency improvements deliver 50% of the climate action in the 2030s to keep us on a 1.5 degree centigrade path.
Yeah, the famous unfamous target. Tell us some good news, please.
Well, our climate commissioner, Wopke Hoekstra, once again cut the striking figure.
That's it? Well, okay, we will move on then. When it comes to highlights, Professor Simone Borghesi, the head of the delegation of the European University Institute in Baku, was a tad more optimistic than you're being right now.
Sometimes I feel a bit depressed because nothing seems to happen. But in reality, there are times of preparation that might, that's my hope, push forward things next year. This time, the expectations were very low for many reasons, including the US elections result. But next time, they will be very high, and I don't think we can afford to fail.
How do you feel about it, and how do you feel about the first draft we've got our hands on?
At the end of the day, this text matters little in the sense that, yes, there's a careful, tenuous balance between like leaving enough options open and closing off some avenues. Texts do need to meet that criteria, so they need to be able to be in the compromise space. And the text itself is sufficiently broad to leave sufficient room for political maneuvering. But at the end of the day, none of this matters unless there's political consensus to be found. And on that sense, I think that the outlook is rather gloomy right now.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, it has been reported that developed and developing countries have very quite different targets in mind, at least for the moment. What has been the focus of the EU delegation in Baku?
We, as developed EU countries and the global south, currently are not really getting each other. Mm-hmm. In the sense that for developing countries, it's all about numbers. 200 billion, 400 billion, 660 billion, and up to $1.3 trillion are the figures that are being floated by developing countries.
Yeah, I spoke about the mismatch with Borghesi as well.
You can really feel the tension between developed and developing countries on the responsibility assignment and the urgency to include gender, health, and inclusive language that was an obstacle to do some progress in some cases. So I think the perception of a division was stronger than in last COPs, at least for me, was the bad part. But obviously, we didn't have high expectations on this COP. We know it's a COP on the way to the next COP. It's important that we come up with some technical aspects that leads the way to COP30.
Yet, at the same time, their language on actually engaging in climate action, in the negotiation sense, it's called mitigation, is not nearly as ambitious. Like the numbers that they're calling for don't match the level of climate ambition that they're communicating. Meanwhile, the EU is coming at this from a totally different perspective, in the sense that we are very much in the implementation stage of climate action. We reduced our emissions by 8% last year. And at the same time, all of us are either in a government or in a budgetary crisis.
Right.
Germany, government collapsed in the lead up to COP. France, non-stop budgetary crisis, which is always this close to bringing the country to fall. The Netherlands, not so much interested in climate finance these days. Spain, busy with domestic matters. Poland, historically not that active either. And the US, of course, nobody knows whether they're still going to be in the Paris Agreement next week. Which means that while developing countries, so that's traditionally the group of 77 poorest countries plus China, want big numbers, we want big climate action commitments.
More right after the ad.
What are children's realities in Europe? Read Eurochal's Progress and Gaps report, examining the state of poverty, social exclusion, and governmental efforts in 31 countries, and see what can be done to respect, protect, and fulfill children's rights.
Yeah, so how do you assess their strategy so far in view of this mismatch?
I think that now there's a sense of honesty setting in as the most senior people are realizing that time is running out. Germany's foreign minister, who handles climate diplomacy, Annalena Baerbock, was brutally honest about communicating that our first priority is creating a reliable climate finance path until 2030, because we want to avoid, and this is a bit of a shared trauma, that with the pledged 100 billion climate finance, which we initially failed to meet, our counterparts in the Global South kept telling us, why is this not happening? Why aren't you delivering? And this time we want to avoid these 3 or 4 lost years where we make a promise that we struggle to uphold.
Yeah.
So by being honest about this, that we have limited room to offer money also due to political reasons, there's a potential for convergence.
So look, we're offering what we can do and we're not over-promising because last time it happened, we did not deliver, right? That's more or less what the message is.
Well, we never overpromised. The EU is by far the single biggest global climate finance donor. We are arguably the only industrial nations that ever lived up to any sort of pledges. But it's more of we're being seen as part of the flock, and we want to make sure that it's all aligned and that everybody's pulling in the same direction.
And moving beyond Brussels' interests, we've already discussed a little bit what the climate finance goal should be like for developing countries, but what numbers are being thrown around by other developed countries then? Is 200 billion the final number at the end of the day? Because that would reflect inflation and not much more compared to 2009 when the 100 billion target was first imposed.
So whenever we talk about the 220 billion, we have a vague media report of a confidential negotiator that we believe belongs to the EU delegation, telling it to a reporter, but nonetheless.
But how do you feel about this 200 billion target?
Analytically, I think it's a good floor to start discussions.
And processes were discussed at length during G20 in Rio de Janeiro as well. In the conclusions, we can read that we need to rapidly scale up climate finance from billions to trillions from all sources. Quite vague, isn't it? What do you make of this statement?
On a scale from 1 to 10, when it comes to the G20 statement, I think this one lands approximately at around a 5, because it was so strongly driven by China and other countries, particularly Brazil as the host, to have something in there on climate finance to help unblock the negotiations in Baku. But at the same time, leaders stayed sufficiently unspecific on the exact details of what the agreement in Baku should entail. Going from billions to trillions is something that everybody has said in some way, shape, or form, but primarily the G77 plus China.
Yeah.
While mobilizing finance from all sources does not call out anybody in particular and can thereby be sort of interpreted by parties at their behest. Meaning that while there is a certain level of political impulse, it is much more so the fact that it was introduced into the statement that matters less so than the text of it.
And on top of that, COP kind of served as a platform for Brazil and Argentina to finance a major fracking project on the sideline of the conference.
This should surprise nobody because COPs have always been a space for deal making between countries. At the same time, Brazil's engagement in this should not come as a surprise to anybody, given that last year during COP they chose that moment in time to join OPEC. Unless you're a genuine activist, the fact that there's energy deals struck on the sidelines of a COP just means that people came to do business, which is both a good and a bad sign, in my opinion.
Well, especially if it's fossil fuel business.
On the one hand, yes. On the second hand, I would say the upside is it's not coal, it's not oil, it's gas.
Yeah.
Yet, gas is not without problems by any means. The hope is then obviously that this will never come into fruition because what I and parts of, I think, the Western negotiation sphere are betting on is the fact that getting cheap renewables built out as fast as possible is going to outpace a lot of these fossil fuel investment agreements that are complicated and often hard to implement. And by the time that the drills would start, maybe there's already an extra 15 gigawatts of solar panels there, and it becomes superfluous.
So innovation as inevitable, in a way.
I think the era of innovation in renewables, in some way, shape, or form, is already done. What happens now is implementation. It's getting diggers to dig up the ground. Yeah.
So I know you will be closely following the end of the negotiations. When can we expect any results? And what will come out of COP29 talks, do you think?
Let me start from the worst, arguably. There is a precedent that Azerbaijanis just never declare the COP as over, which could see it continue into 2025 until the next Bonn Midway meeting. this is the worst case. The second worst case is that negotiations proceed until Sunday night, at which point everybody is going to have to get into their airplanes because they have a proper day-to-day business to return to. And perhaps the presidency will strong-arm parties into a very weak, non-specific text that all people can agree to in principle, but will have changed nothing.
And lastly,
in a perfect world, we overcome our differences. We make a credible commitment to mobilize a level of finance that developing countries can be satisfied with, while at the same time they recognize that we really don't want to keep talking about mitigation, meaning climate action, because to the EU it is crazy that every year we have to renegotiate the fact that fossil fuels should be phased out and that renewables should be installed.
Thank you, Niko, and a special thanks to Professor Simone Borghesi. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our newsletters, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. Don't forget to leave us a star review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This podcast was produced by Miriam Sainz de Tejada, Charles Cohen, and I. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.